rule follower, ultimately. I was kind of the opposites. Maybe that is an opposites kind of attract each other. But have you ever noticed in life how many rules there are? And when I think back and I remember back to the first grade. This was way back in the country where I grew up. It was back before we had preschool and kindergarten. And so I remember a conversation with my mom when she took me out to the end of the driveway and put me out there to wait for the school bus, that there was a bunch of rules that we had to follow. The number one rule was that I was not allowed to empty the mud puddles and splash my sisters. Evidently, I had that tendency. I was supposed to obey what the bus driver told me to do. I was supposed to sit in my seat when the bus. There was just this. I was just amazed at 6 years old, all these rules that you had to follow just to ride the bus to school. You had to wait for the bus to come to a complete stop. You had to wait for the paddle to come out. You had to wait for the lights to go on, and you had to obey. But it doesn't get better. I remember when in my country, when we, at 15, we were able to get our learner's permits to start driving, and all the rules that you had to obey and learn to be able to get your driver's license. And school was the same way. There were always these rules that you had to follow. Work is not any different. There's always rules of work. Even at home, have you noticed that? Even at home, there are rules that you have to follow. And consequences if you don't follow them. You ever wondered why? Why that is? Seems to me it's because words for a lot of us, maybe not all of us, but it seems like a lot of us, words are just not enough. We as people just don't listen very well. Or even if we listen, maybe we just don't obey. We don't do what we're told. And so we have rules, but then there are also penalties, consequences, if you don't follow the rules, usually. And the worst of those also when you do something that's bad enough that the police can arrive at your house and you get to go live somewhere else for a while. When we look at the Bible, it's pretty clear that God has the same issues with us. The same issues we had in school, kindergarten, on the bus, and all the way up the line. God has the same issues with us. We just don't want to listen. Or if we listen, we don't like to obey. And so God sent prophets to tell us, in like a louder voice, what it was that God was trying to tell us. And he eventually, even with the prophets, resorted to not just preaching, he resorted to a style of preaching, I'll say, kind of like what we used when we were in ministry with children with object lessons. That he gave prophets something that was much more dramatic that they were supposed to do to get people's attention so they would listen to what God was trying to say. Now, a couple of quick examples of that. There was two of the prophets that the Jewish people, in the setting that we're going to look at today, the Palm Sunday message, that they would have known exactly who they were talking about, Jeremiah and Ezekiel. One of the examples for Jeremiah was, it starts in Jeremiah 13. I'm not going to read you the whole story. But God told him to go and buy a linen, a cloth belt for his robe. He was supposed to make a big deal in front of the people about having this new belt, wearing it and showing it off to all of the people. And then he had to go take it out and bury it, wait for a while, and then go back and dig it up, and you would know what kind of position it was in. It was rotted and falling apart. That was an example to the people of how Judah and Jerusalem were acting before God. He said it was their pride that was causing them to be ruined as God's people. And then in Jeremiah 27, he tells the prophet to go and make a yoke. I'm not talking about the yoke of an egg. I'm talking about the yoke you would see like on oxen when they would pull wagons or pull carts. Jeremiah had to make one and put it on and wear it as he was going through the streets for a period of time to be able to explain to people as he invited all the kings of the regions around them that he was telling them that Nebuchadnezzar, who was kind of I'll just say that, he was kind of the power broker of the area, and he was going to war with people. The priests were telling everyone that if they would just, let me put it this way, they were telling people what they wanted to hear. God was telling them that this king was being sent as a punishment to them for their lack of obedience to God. And if they would just surrender and take their medicine for a while, it would be over and God would reestablish Israel as a powerhouse. But the priests and the politicians of the day were telling them what they wanted to hear. What they wanted to hear was that if we all just fight and get stronger and stronger, that God will eventually protect us. And the prophet was telling them they are lying to you. God has said that if you resist them, it'll be worse. They'll destroy your cities and kill most of you and take you as slaves. Well, folks like to hear what they like to hear. They didn't want to hear the truth. And so it got worse for them. Ezekiel was one of the prophets that God told him when the people weren't listening. This is in Ezekiel chapter 4. He was to draw a picture on a clay tablet. That would be like going into the city square downtown someplace and setting up an easel. And he was supposed to draw a picture of Jerusalem. And in this picture, he was supposed to add armies arriving and battering rams being erected and trenches being built around the city, and all these acts of war was taking place as the enemy was going to come in and lay siege to Jerusalem, starve everyone to death, and then murder the people that were left to get their attention. They would have noticed that the prophet was out drawing this picture, and probably what we would do, well, what are you drawing? And they would hear the sermon that God wanted them to hear. And then in the next chapter, he tells them, he takes it even as maybe they weren't listening well enough. He takes it to the next level. You remember in Bible time, we all have a picture of Jesus with long hair and a big flowing beard, and all the disciples. It was culturally what they did, and it's still kind of that way. The prophet was told by God to take a sharp sword. I'm betting he sharpened it. And he publicly had to shave his head and shave his beard, and then burn what was left and do a lot of go through Israel with the sword, cutting his long hair into pieces and dropping it on the ground, and then saving one small portion of his hair in his robe to say that God would save a remnant of the people. It was dramatic. God was trying to get their attention. This dramatic action was something that Jesus noted. And in the scripture we're going to look at today, which is the scripture leading into Holy Week. And Jesus, I believe, follows this tradition, that surely he would have known these stories of what Jeremiah and Ezekiel did and what God had them do. And so Jesus steps up the preaching that he had been doing and makes it more dramatic. They pick up the story, and it's in your worship orders in Luke 19, beginning with verses 28. This is one of the scriptures about the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. After telling this story, Jesus went on toward Jerusalem, walking ahead of his disciples. As he came to the towns of Bethphage and Bethany on the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 disciples ahead. Now Jesus had always walked everywhere he went, except for a few times when we read about when he had some boat rides. But it's clear as we read this portion of Scripture that this wasn't just an impromptu thing that takes place. Everything that takes place in this story that we read about, Jesus had planned it ahead of time. He knew. He had talked to people. He had arranged for things to take place. And they had like a code word that would be used to signal, okay, what I had talked to you about and what we're going to plan to do, it's going to happen now. We read on in verse 30. He says, go into that village. Over there, he told them. As you enter it, you will see a young donkey tied there that no one has ever ridden. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone asks, why are you untying that colt? Just say, the Lord needs it. Now, if you just said that, normally people will say, Lord who? But he had talked to these people. It was a code word. The Lord needs it. So they went and found the colt, just as Jesus had said. And sure enough, as they were untying it, the owners asked them, why are you untying that colt? Wouldn't you say that if you saw someone outside getting into your truck and trying to drive off with it? Well, they would do. And the disciples simply replied, the Lord needs it. So they brought the colt to Jesus and threw the garments over for him to ride. Jerusalem was accustomed to political leaders, to kings coming into town and marching in, making statements. Now, in times of war, when some kind of a person was trying to show their wealth or their power or the size of their army, they would come in marching that and showing that. They would come marching in. You can kind of draw the picture in your mind of seeing an imperial parade begin to come into the city, where they would come with their cavalry on their horses, the cavalry riding their horses, hundreds of foot soldiers with their leather armor shined up, and their spears and their swords and their shields, everything shined up as if they were on a parade. Their flags fluttering, their company colors showing. And the sounds of the marching feet and the clinking armor, the creaking of the leather of the bridles, and the beating of the drums that go with it. And always there were silent onlookers. The people who just happened to be passing through or who lived there had nothing to do with the procession or the people who had arranged it, but they would hear and see what was taking place. Oh, there's a parade. Look, let's go see what's happening. Some would always be curious. Some would be awed. Oh, wow, that king must be wonderful and powerful. And some might be resentful. Everyone that was Jewish knew what the scriptures taught, that the Messiah would come someday. And in our own way of thinking, they had to have thought that he has to have power to be able to overthrow the Romans. But in times of peace, they also knew that a king could come riding in intentionally, rather than on a war horse with swords and spears. They would come riding in on a donkey. No soldiers, no weapons, no show of force. And imagine this scene. We have a preacher, I would say an evangelist, that had been a carpenter, that now has a price on his head, riding into town on a donkey. Pretty dramatic. Pretty insightful statement that he was making. I don't think that they could have ignored the obvious thing that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah. God's anointed king. And it was just as obvious that the kingdom that he was offering was not what they wanted or expected. Because why would the Messiah come and leave the Romans in power? He was offering a kingdom of peace, love, mercy, and forgiveness. All in all, pretty good. But they had been an occupied country for many years. I'm guessing that most of them wanted revenge. They wanted payback. Verse 36, it goes on. As he rode along, the crowd spread out their garments on the road ahead of him. This also was not a new thing, because in 2 Kings 9, we read a story about a King Jehu that when he comes riding into Jerusalem, the people did the same thing. It says they hurried and take their cloaks and spread them on the steps in front of him and shouted, "Jehu is king." This is part of their culture. This is part of what they did. It's kind of like how you've seen and done since many years ago when we call it the red carpet treatment. But even for us, when a dignitary, when a king or a president from another country comes to visit, when the Queen of England comes to visit in Washington, they do a red carpet ceremony. It's planned. There's someone that's hired to roll out the red carpet, to put up the decorations, to have cheerers out there. Have you ever noticed, even in a secular concert, let's say like at the halftime at the Super Bowl, maybe you've never watched the stuff that goes on there, but it's clear to me that at those concerts, there are people that are paid. Maybe they're not paid, maybe they're just grateful for the opportunity to be able to get on camera a little bit. But they're grouped around the stage, and they're just acting crazy. They're just screaming and yelling and just in love with this singer. And they're part of the paid. They're told to do that. Many of them are paid to do that. It was the same then. Processions were planned, and they had people, kind of plants, I would call them. People who were there to get things moving. People also within that culture. Once that procession started, and this dignitary was going down the red carpet, they would have planted people who would start taking their robes off. It was a cultural issue. It's kind of like how you would say, "Oh, I love the celebrity. I listen to their music." And so you take your coat off and let her walk on it. And then you could say, "Elvis walked on my coat." It was kind of, and it would also be like showing your honor and your support of what they were doing. So it was a cultural thing combined with a planned activity. So they were showing there as Jesus walked. And the excitement built. And all these people were going with the planned ones and the spontaneous ones. The people kind of chimed in. They joined in with the festivities. John is the one in his gospel. And Matthew says that they began to cut branches off. John tells us that they cut palm limbs down and laid them down on the road in front, which is why we call it Palm Sunday. Verse 37, the story goes on. When he reached the place where the road started down the Mount of Olives, all of his followers began to shout and sing as they walked along, praising God for all the wonderful miracles that they had seen. Now, this is a mixed crowd. The disciples and the followers, the people who had been with Jesus, who had been there with all these exciting things taking place, the people that knew that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, they were starting the cheering and taking their coats off, and other people joined in. People heard the excitement. They knew it was a procession. They knew it was someone famous and important. And when they heard the people shouting, Jesus of Nazareth, other people took it up and began shouting too. The arriving crowd, as more and more people began to recognize him. Probably some of them had been to those preaching opportunities. They had seen or known of someone that was healed of leprosy, of the blind man who was made to see, the guy who was deaf and became to hear, the lame who walked in the storms that he stilled, how he walked on water, and just a few weeks ago that he raised this man from the dead. You remember, he'd been dead for 4 days, and Jesus brought him back to life. Who wouldn't want to be a part of that excitement? And so he entered Jerusalem, riding on a donkey. And they were convinced in the emotion of that moment that nothing could stop him. He could just speak the words, and the Romans would just disappear. God would just blow them away with breath. And it tells us that it began to chant a portion of Scripture from a beloved king in the past, King David. is from Psalm 118 and verse 38. And they say, "Blessed be the King that cometh in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And I don't see how it's not possible that the Pharisees who are there watching this take place, in their robes and their finery, mortified, angry. Remember, they put a price on his head. Angry that he's getting all of this attention and he's getting more powerful. At the very least, the Pharisees had to remember the prophecy from 500 years earlier in Zechariah 9:9-10. This is what it says. 500 years before Jesus came, it was written, "Rejoice greatly, daughter Zion. Shout in triumph, daughter Jerusalem. Look, your king is coming to you. He is righteous and victorious, humble and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the horse from Jerusalem. The bow of war will be removed, and he will proclaim peace to the nations. His dominion will extend from sea to sea, from the Euphrates River to the ends of the earth." And the Pharisees didn't like that he sounded like that prophecy. They didn't like what they were seeing. They were going to lose their control. Clearly, they just didn't care that they put a price on his head. They were going to lose their power. They were going to lose their influence. And so it says in verse 39 that some of the Pharisees among the crowd said, "Teacher." Remember, they're seeing everything that's taking place, this excitement, this carnival atmosphere. They said, "Teacher, rebuke your followers for saying things like that." He replied, "If they keep quiet, the stones along the road would burst into cheers." The Pharisees knew that Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah. They understood it perfectly. They rejected it. They didn't believe that he was the Messiah. And so we see I think it's important to remember 3 different kinds of groups in this parade procession. There was that, I'll call it a clash. There was a small group of the insiders, like us. They were believers. They'd been with him from the beginning. They were his close friends. He knew them by name. They were there. They were the ones stirring the fire, getting people to understand their friend Jesus, the Messiah, that God sent from heaven. And there were others. Zacchaeus, Mark, Mary, and Lazarus. There were the people who had been lepers, who had been healed. The men who had been blind, who had been made to see. And all those 5,000 people that were fed in that time when he multiplied the food, these people were all scattered throughout the crowd. But there was a kind of a neutral crowd. You had pro-group, the hate group of the disciples who were standing there shaking their heads and frowning and shaking their finger. "I'm going to call the police." And there were all the neutral folks, kind of watching this take place, either hating Jesus or loving him, just there for the party. But they were Jewish.
4 minutes.
They knew what Zechariah said. They knew about Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They'd heard about Jesus. They had to decide, am I going to follow what my priest said? Or am I going to follow Jesus? Which one? In verse 41 it goes on. But as he came closer to Jerusalem and saw the city ahead, he began to weep. Coming down from the Mount Mount of Olives. You're around the corner, and then you have a kind of a magnificent view of Jerusalem as it lays out before you. Jesus, as he rounds that corner and looks at Jerusalem, he knows what is coming for the city. He knows that they're choosing to follow the priest and not listen to what he said. He knows that the politics of what these people are doing is going to lead them to the point that in 70 years, it's history for us as we read back. He was predicting the future. When the 70 AD, when the Roman army laid siege to Jerusalem, starves them out. The prophets have predicted it. This is what he says in verse 42. It is a prophecy. How I wish today that you of all people would understand the way to peace. But now it is too late, and peace is hidden from your eyes. Before long, your enemies will build ramparts against your walls and encircle you and close in on you from every side. They will crush you into the ground, and your children with you. Your enemies will not leave a single stone in place, because you did not accept your opportunity for salvation. The same way that Jesus today, this is what we preach and teach, that Jesus sees our personal suffering today. He knows our names, and he knows what those issues are within our lives. That's this day. In the scripture that we're looking, as he comes around the corner and sees, it's like his hometown. People that he knows their names and where they live. And he knows what's coming for them. While some of the people are just enjoying the parade, but choices are being made. The question I have is, which group are you this Palm Sunday? Over 2,000 years later. Remember those three groups? The one group that is rejecting him. The other group that is loving him. And then all the majority of the people who are just standing on the sidelines, watching the parade go by. Which you? Father, today I thank you for your word. I thank you for this time that we can celebrate what you did for mankind and for us, what you did for me individually. Build a bridge for me to back to God. Thank you for that. And thank you for the reminders that you place in